I was 45 when I realized I had become invisible. Not to strangers, strangers still saw me. In the grocery store line, at the bank, on the sidewalk, they saw me, smiled politely, maybe offered a hand if I dropped my purse. But to my family, I had vanished. They spoke around me, over me. They made plans and gave updates like I was a shadow on the wall. I was Claire, the poor thing. That was my new identity. My name used to mean something. I used to have stories, opinions, ideas. Now, I was a cautionary tale in their minds. A woman who had survived too much and therefore should expect nothing more. You look tired, my sister would say, handing me leftovers like I was a charity case. My nephew once asked me if I used to have a job. I did. I had a life, a marriage, a future, before everything fell apart. It started with my divorce at 41. My husband, Patrick, didn't leave me for someone younger. He left me for someone shinier. A woman with fewer scars, fewer responsibilities, fewer stories. She was his new beginning. I was his closed chapter. He took the house. I kept the memories. My mother called it unfortunate. My sister called it predictable. No one called me strong. After the divorce, I moved into a small apartment. I took a job as a part-time receptionist for a dentist who had more degrees than empathy. The job barely paid the bills, but I needed the distraction. I needed to feel useful, even if only to answer phones and refill coffee. My father, at least, didn't treat me like a ghost. He was a man of few words, but his silence never felt like judgment. He would take me to lunch every Thursday, always the same place, a quiet, old-fashioned Italian diner downtown. He never said much, just listened. Sometimes that was enough. He had worked for the same shipping company for 40 years. Started at the docks, worked his way up to regional manager. He was loyal, strict, and known for being the kind of man who shook hands and meant it. I think he knew I was drowning in small ways I couldn't articulate, but he never pried. Then he died. A heart attack. Quick, sudden, and cruel. He left behind a modest savings account, a few boxes of medals and service plaques, and one envelope. At the funeral, my family barely noticed me. They hovered near the casket, sobbing and clinging to one another like they were starring in a tragedy. No one asked if I was okay. After the burial, while everyone went back to eating finger foods and gossiping about who looked older, I stayed behind. That's when Mr. Reinhardt approached me. He was my father's boss, or had been. A tall man, impossibly well-dressed for his age, with eyes like steel and a voice that didn't rise above necessary. "Claire," he said, handing me the envelope. "Your father wanted you to have this privately." He didn't stay for questions. He just gave a nod and walked away like the world owed him nothing. I waited until I got home to open it. My hands were shaking. Inside, a letter, handwritten by my father, 6 pages. His handwriting was rough but clear. He wrote that he had watched me for the last few years and had seen what the world had done to me, that he knew I felt unseen, unloved, discarded. He wrote that he had been saving something, not just money, but trust, legacy. And at the bottom of the letter, a name, Reinhardt, logistics, and a statement. I spoke to Victor. He agreed. "You are my daughter, and you are capable. I'm leaving my shares to you." I read it twice, 3 times. Then I just sat there and cried. Not from the money, I didn't even know what the shares were worth, but because it was the first time in years someone had said, "I see you. You matter." A week later, I met Mr. Reinhardt again, this time in his office. Everything smelled of leather and coffee. He welcomed me, respectfully but with caution. "I gave him my word," he said, "so I'll give you my time. Don't waste it." And I didn't. Over the next months, I learned the business. I studied logistics, watched operations, asked questions that made men twice my age shift uncomfortably in their seats. I read every report, every spreadsheet, every contract. I stayed late, I took notes. I made mistakes, but I never repeated them. And slowly, things changed. People started knocking on my door, asking me for opinions. My last name opened the gate, but my work kept me at the table. Meanwhile, my family assumed I had picked up some temp job in customer service. They asked how my little receptionist gig was going. I didn't correct them, let them talk. Until one day, my sister called in a panic. Her husband had been laid off. They were behind on the mortgage. She needed help. I wouldn't ask. She said, "But you're the only one with a stable job right now." I transferred the money. Quietly, no questions. And I said nothing about the view from my new office. Sometimes I wondered what my father would say if he could see me. The daughter, they all pitied now, sitting in executive meetings. with men who wore $5,000 watches but couldn't spell resilience. There were nights I stayed late at the office, not out of necessity, but because it felt like the first space I owned. A space where I wasn't labeled or belittled, where every decision, every analysis, every instinct was mine. And for the first time in over a decade, I felt like I was building something, not just a career, but dignity, identity, a future that belonged to me and me alone. I didn't need to be rescued, I needed to be trusted. And my father gave me that gift not in words, but in legacy. So no, I wasn't the poor thing, I was just underestimated. And that was their mistake. 1 week later, she showed up at my office. No warning, no call. She just appeared in the reception area, dressed in soft tones, carrying a forced smile and a tray of pastries like she was auditioning for a reconciliation drama. I was in the area, she said. Thought I'd stop by and say hi. I asked my assistant to clear my schedule for 15 minutes. I wasn't angry, just curious. She never did anything without a reason. She walked in slowly, eyes roaming the room. The bookshelves, the framed awards, the polished desk, the custom nameplate. "This is impressive," she murmured. I waited. She sat down, crossed her legs, tilted her head like we were teenagers again, gossiping about boys. "I've been thinking," she began. "We don't spend enough time together. We're sisters. We used to be close. We weren't. Not really." But she had rewritten history in her head. She talked for 10 minutes about family, about how hard things had been for everyone, about how she missed our bond. And then finally, she said it. "There's an investment opportunity I thought you'd be perfect for." There it was. She wasn't here to reconnect. She was here because now I had something she wanted. Money, influence, access. "I've always believed in you," she added quickly, sensing my silence. "Even when things were rough, I told Mom, Claire just needs time. She's a fighter." I looked at her then, not with anger, but with clarity. "You told Mom I was pathetic." I said. "You said I was a burden, that I should move in with her so I wouldn't rot in that sad little apartment alone." She flinched. I stood. The meeting was over. "You can leave the pastries." My assistant likes sweets. That was the last time she visited unannounced. But it wasn't the end. In the weeks that followed, my family became strangely attentive. My cousin invited me to her bridal shower. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years called to say she'd been thinking about me. My brother-in-law emailed me a pitch deck. Suddenly, I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I was the family's new potential sponsor. But I didn't bend, I didn't lash out either. I just watched, observed, and quietly, I began to plan. Because there comes a moment in every story when the protagonist stops surviving and starts orchestrating. For me, it began with a charity gala. The Reinhardt Foundation was hosting a major event, black tie, televised with political figures, CEOs, and media coverage. I was asked to give the keynote address. It was an honor and an opportunity. I knew my family would see the invitation online. I knew my name would be in the press. I knew they would come not out of pride, but out of curiosity. And I welcomed it. I wore a deep emerald gown that night, sleek and sharp like a blade. My speech was brief but heartfelt. I spoke about reinvention, legacy, and the quiet strength of being underestimated. When I stepped down from the stage, applause filled the room. And in the back, I saw them, my mother, my sister, a few others, dressed beautifully, clapping with stiff hands and wide eyes, watching me like strangers who suddenly realized they'd misjudged the woman in front of them. Afterward, my mother approached. "You were wonderful," she said, voice quivering. "You always had it in you." She hadn't said those words when I was sobbing on her couch after the divorce. She hadn't said them when I was eating canned soup for dinner and counting pennies at the gas station. But now that the world was watching, now I was worth praising. I nodded politely, but I didn't hug her. She didn't know me anymore. I had become something entirely new. Not because of revenge, not because I wanted to rub it in their faces, but because I finally stopped waiting for their approval. I had built a life they couldn't reduce to pity. And that, in itself, was justice. Still, there was one more thing I had to do. Thank you all for being here today. This center was a dream. My father's dream, a man who gave 40 years of service to this city and who believed that legacies weren't just built, they were lived. Faces turned toward me, and I continued. He believed in effort, in second chances, in rebuilding what others discarded. And today, we honor not just his memory, but everything he stood for. Applause filled the room, hesitant at first, then warm. I saw people begin to connect the dots. Some whispered, some stared, Then the screens flickered. Footage began to play. Old photos of my father, working at the docks, shaking hands with employees, mentoring young men. And then newer images. Me, overseeing the construction, signing papers, talking to staff, leading. There was no denying it anymore. I wasn't just his daughter, I was the woman who brought his vision to life. And then came the reveal. Behind the stage, a curtain dropped. On the wall was a plaque in bronze, gleaming under the soft lighting. The Victor Center, founded by Claire Whitman in honor of her father's legacy. There was silence. And then gasps. And then something even more powerful: respect. I didn't need their praise. But I watched it dawn on them anyway. The woman they had written off, ignored, pitied, had built something they never could. My sister walked up to me after the ceremony, her hands clutching her purse like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "You really did all this?" she asked, voice small. I nodded. I thought maybe the company had just let you use their name." "No," I said. "They didn't give me anything. I earned it." She didn't respond. Later, that night, my ex-husband came by. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller, somehow. "This place is incredible," he said, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Your father would be proud." I didn't answer. He hesitated, then added, "You look ... different, stronger." "I am," I said. He nodded, then walked away. No apologies, no confessions, just silence. And honestly, that was enough, because I didn't need validation anymore. I had built something real. That night, I stood alone in the main hall after everyone had gone. I ran my fingers along the plaque. I whispered, "We did it, Dad." And for the first time in decades, I felt peace. They had called me the poor thing, the failure, the one who didn't make it, but now I wasn't waiting for a seat at their table. I had built my own table, and it was full. 2 weeks after the center opened, I received a letter, not an email, a handwritten letter. It was from my mother. I hadn't received anything from her in years, not even a birthday card. But this letter was 5 pages long, written in ink that had smeared in places, like she'd started crying midway and didn't bother starting over. She wrote about regret, about how she didn't know how to handle strong women because she'd never learned how to be one herself, about how she thought protecting my sister, the fragile one, was easier than accepting me, the one who broke silently but kept walking. And then the last line, "I know I failed you. I just hope one day you'll sit at our table again." I read it twice. And then I put it in a drawer, not to forget, but because I no longer needed to reply right away. I had learned that closure doesn't always come with conversation. Sometimes it comes with becoming the person they swore you'd never be. Still, her words echoed. The center was flourishing. Programs were full. Kids were signing up. Parents were volunteering. But a part of me remained unsettled, like I had unfinished business, like the final thread had yet to be pulled. And then it came. I was asked to speak at a national logistics conference, one of the most prestigious in the industry. I was scheduled right after the keynote from the CEO of a competing firm, none other than David Melrose. David was my ex-husband's mentor, the man who had once told Patrick, over dinner, that I was a lovely wife, but not very business-minded, that I was better suited for home than the boardroom. He had laughed when he said it, so I accepted the invitation. Not to confront him, but to eclipse him. The day of the conference, I walked into the hotel ballroom where the event was held, surrounded by high ceilings, cold marble, and colder stairs. These were men who had built their empires on exclusion. Men who had turned respect into a currency and handed it out like inheritance. Melrose spoke first. Polished, confident, well-rehearsed, but something in his delivery felt stale, recycled, like a man repeating the story he'd told too many times. Then came my turn. I walked up to the stage with no PowerPoint, no fancy graphics, just a voice, just truth. I spoke of infrastructure, of crisis response, of rebuilding routes after natural disasters, but mostly I spoke of people, of how the industry had overlooked human potential for decades, especially women. Single parents, immigrants, older workers. I told the story of my father, of legacy, of being written off, and returning stronger. And then I paused, looked across the sea of suits, and I said, "You don't need to be handed a seat at the table. Sometimes you build the damn table yourself and make it stronger than the one they refuse to share." The room erupted. Some clapped, some stood. Melrose didn't, but that was fine, because it wasn't for him. After the conference, a small group gathered around me. Journalists, executives, young women in the field, wide-eyed and burning with questions. One of them said, "Your story, how did you keep going when no one believed in you?" And I told her I stopped waiting for permission. That was the beginning. By the time I returned home, messages had poured in. Social media was flooded. My speech had been clipped, shared, reposted. The woman who built the table. That's what they were calling me. And for the first time, I felt known. Not for my pain, not for my past, but for my power. Then came the message that surprised me most. It was from Mr. Reinhardt. He was retiring, and he wanted me to take his place officially as the new CEO. I stared at the message, hands trembling. This was it, the final door, the door I never thought I'd be invited through. But when I walked into his office the next day, he greeted me with his usual nod. Always the same man, always exact. "I knew your father for 30 years, he said, "but I've only respected one Whitman more than him, and that's you." He slid the contract across the table. No speeches, no flowery compliments, just legacy being passed from one hand to another. I signed it, and when I walked out of that office, I didn't feel like I'd climbed a ladder. I felt like I'd built a staircase no one else dared to imagine. A week after I became CEO, my sister called again. I didn't answer right away, not out of spite, just peace. That kind of calm you feel when you no longer owe anyone an explanation. I let the phone ring, then ring again. She texted later, "Can we talk? It's important." I met her at a quiet cafe near the harbor. No cameras, no headlines. Just two women who used to share a bedroom and now barely shared the same reality. She was already seated when I arrived, nervous, her fingers playing with the handle of her coffee cup. "I know I've made mistakes," she began. "I didn't know how to be there for you back then. I thought you were fragile. I thought if I pushed you too hard, you'd fall apart." I let her speak. "I never imagined you'd rise like this. I'm not jealous." She paused. "Okay, maybe I am. But it's more than that. It's guilt, Claire. Heavy, old guilt." For a moment, I saw the little girl I once defended in the schoolyard. The one I shared cookies with. The one I carried when she twisted her ankle during a summer hike. "I believed what they said about you," she whispered. "That you were ruined, broken, but I was wrong." I nodded. "I'm not broken," I said. "I was just rebuilding." Tears welled in her eyes. "Do you think we'll ever be close again?" I thought about it. About how long it had taken me to build my life from ashes. About how many nights I'd spent questioning if love could survive betrayal. And then I said, "I don't know. But I think we can start with honesty." She nodded. And for once, didn't try to hug me. She respected the space. That was new. That night, I went home to an inbox full of messages. One was from a former professor who had seen the conference speech. He offered me a guest lecture at the university. Another was from a young woman, barely 24, telling me she'd been thinking of quitting her job until she heard me speak. And another, this one I read 3 times, was from Patrick. He asked to meet. I agreed. Not because I wanted closure, but because I wanted to see, face to face, what time had done to the man who once said I was too heavy to carry. We met at a restaurant downtown. Neutral ground. He was already there when I arrived, looking tired. His hair thinner, his hands restless. "I saw the article," he said, "about the foundation, about you." I waited. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I chose comfort over character. I married someone who made me feel powerful. But in the end, I felt small." I didn't ask how his marriage was going. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he added. "I just needed to say it out loud. I was wrong. You were never the problem." That was the first time he'd ever said anything close to the truth. I didn't cry. I didn't snap. I just nodded and said, "I hope you find peace." That was it. No drama, no slap, no wine thrown across the table. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is becoming someone they can't reach anymore. As I left the restaurant, my phone buzzed again. It was from Mr. Reinhardt's assistant. He had passed away that morning. I stopped walking, let the wind hit me, let the grief sit quietly on my chest. I owed that man more than I could express. Not because he handed me a title, but because he didn't look away when the world did. He had made space for me in a room I didn't think I belonged in, and in doing so, helped me see I could build rooms of my own. I called a board meeting 2 days later and proposed a new scholarship fund under the company's name, the Reinhardt Initiative for Women Over 40 Returning to the Workforce. It passed unanimously. In the weeks that followed, something shifted inside me, like the final key had clicked into place. I began writing again. I started journaling every night about the years no one talks about. The quiet pain of becoming invisible, the rage of being underestimated, the slow, sacred power of rebuilding. And one night, I wrote something that stayed with me. They call me the poor thing, but I was never poor. I was rich in resilience, they just couldn't see it yet. Months passed, the center grew. My role expanded, the speech was taught in college classes, I received awards, invitations, even a book deal. But none of that compared to the letter I received on a quiet October morning. It came in a plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a photo of my father at the docks, holding my hand. I couldn't have been more than 7. On the back, in unfamiliar handwriting, "He was always proud of you. He just didn't know how to say it." I never found out who sent it, but it didn't matter, because I knew now. Everything I had become every title, every room I entered, every heart I inspired, all came from the fire I had walked through without burning to ash. I didn't need to be rescued, I needed time and space. And someone just 1% to say, "You're not done yet." Now it was my turn to say it for others. So if you're watching this, if you've ever been called the poor thing, if they wrote you off after 40, or after heartbreak, or after failure, remember this: you're not done yet. You're just getting started. Months passed, seasons changed, but the feeling stayed like a slow-burning warmth inside me that had taken years to catch fire. I no longer walked with my head down. I no longer checked my reflection for approval. I had stopped shrinking. I had stopped apologizing for my existence. And maybe most importantly, I had stopped asking to be loved the way I needed because I had finally learned how to love myself exactly as I was. The center was thriving. The Reinhardt Initiative had already sponsored 6 women back into the workforce. One of them, a 53-year-old former nurse, cried in my office after getting her first job in a decade. She said I thought I was invisible. Until someone like you saw me. I saw her because I had once been her. And I would never forget what it felt like to disappear while still breathing. One morning, I arrived at the center early before the staff, before the children. The building was quiet, still wrapped in sunrise. I walked the halls slowly, letting my fingers brush the walls. These weren't just bricks and beams. They were memory, muscle. Meaning, I stopped in front of the dedication wall. There was my father's plaque. Next to it, a new one, bronze, smaller, in honor of the quiet women, the strong women, the women who rise after being left behind. I stared at it for a long time. It hadn't been part of the official opening. I had placed it there one night after everyone left. Just me, a ladder, and a drill. It was for all of us. All the women who'd been overlooked, underestimated, uninvited, the ones who had their voices talked over, their ambition mistaken for delusion, their strength labeled as too much. We weren't poor things, we were phoenixes. Quiet, revolutions in lipstick, and scars. That day, I gave a tour to a group of students. One of them, a shy girl with a notebook, lingered after the others. She approached me nervously. "Ms. Whitman," she said, "I read your story. I watched the video, and I want to be like you." I smiled. "You will," I said. "You already are. You just haven't grown into it yet." She beamed. And I knew this moment was worth more than any title or headline. That night, I sat at home, glass of wine in hand, watching the city lights flicker through the window. My apartment wasn't grand, but it was mine, decorated with intention, bookshelves full, curtains open, light invited in. There was a time when silence felt like a punishment. Now it felt like peace. I opened my journal one last time and wrote, "I was never lost. I was just on pause." They pitied me because they couldn't imagine surviving what I did. But survival was only the beginning. I didn't just survive them, I outgrew them. And then I built something bigger than they ever allowed themselves to dream. I closed the notebook, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to prove anything. Because the story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation, taking back the space, the voice, the future. The next morning, I woke up to an email from a global women's summit, an invitation to speak as the opening keynote next spring. I smiled and clicked accept. Not because I needed the spotlight, but because the spotlight was no longer a foreign place. It was where I belonged. And now, I wanted to use it to shine on others. If you've ever been called the poor, think if you've been overlooked after a certain age, if they told you your best years were behind you, let this story remind you they were wrong. Your power didn't leave you. It was just waiting for the right moment to rise. So rise. Build your table, write your own letter, plant your legacy. And if this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Send it to someone who needs hope. And subscribe, because we tell stories like yours, the ones that go unheard too long. You are not done. You are just getting started.